So as most of you know, my name is Steve Tinney, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Penn Museum. And as always, many thanks to all of you for coming to tonight's installment of our annual Greats Lectures. This year, of course, our theme is Great Stuff, something we have a lot of in the museum. And we're looking at a whole range of aspects of the topic, including, for example, in the next lecture, how we got some of our stuff. That lecture is entitled The Stuff of Legend, Early 19th Century Excavations at Nippur, and it will be presented on March 6th by Richard Zettler, Associate Curator in charge of the Near East section. As usual, after the lecture, there will be time for questions, which will be moderated by our speaker, and there'll be a microphone going the round so everyone can hear the questions as well as the answers. Now, before I introduce our speaker, a couple of quick programming notes about the museum. For one thing, we are doing a special series of our daily 15-minute talks about objects in the galleries, which is dedicated to Valentine's Day. The Daily Dig, some of you have been to them, I hope, is at 1 p.m. each day. We are open, and the Valentine's series will be extra fun and special. Titles include When a Man Loves a Woman, The Things We Love, Somebody to Love, Love at First Sight, spelled as in archaeological site, I see what they did there, The Book of Love, and The Look of Love. Also coming up soon, on February 23rd, we have a new exhibition opening, Ancient Egypt from Discovery to Display. This will let you follow the journey artifacts take on their way to museum display, from excavation to conservation to storage and research. So very much related to this lecture series, more than 200 fascinating objects, many of which have never been on view before, will be in the galleries upstairs, and the artifact lab will be integrated into that experience. So definitely one to look out for, and a little bit of a preview of some of the stuff that will be in our new reimagined Egypt galleries, which we are designing almost as I speak. So finally, let's talk about our speaker. Dr. Katherine Moore is both practice professor and undergraduate chair in Penn's anthropology department, which is housed in this building. Kate is also the Mainwaring teaching specialist in zooarchaeology in our Center for Analysis of Archaeological Materials. Kate majored in anthropology at Washington University St. Louis and received her PhD from the University of Michigan, go blue, with a dissertation on hunting and the origins of herding in Peru. She has a distinguished record of teaching and researching in laboratories and colleges, including the Harvard Peabody and Bentley College, and in 2016 received the Dean's Award for Distinguished Teaching here at Penn. Kate was the first person to teach CAAM's introductory course, Food and Fire, and her teaching and mentoring in CAAM represent the very best instruction Penn has to offer, and we're grateful to her for that. In addition, Kate has done fieldwork in and controls the zooarchaeology of an almost bewildering range of places. Peru, Bolivia, Mexico, Turkmenistan, Bactria, various places in the US. She's also done formal analysis on materials from sites in Europe and East Africa, and she's published widely on all aspects of this research. Her lengthy bibliography includes both technical and maybe slightly less technical topics, including, to pick two at random to give you a flavor, as it were, from Stable isotope data showed temporal stability in diet at Pecos Pueblo and diet variation among Southwest Pueblos. That was one title. To Food Studies in Archaeology. As if all this weren't enough, Kate was also the curatorial advisor for the first of our student exhibitions here in the museum, Corn, From Ancient Crop to Soda Pop, and did an almost miraculous job of guiding the students through a process that was new to everyone involved. So, I'm very happy that Kate was able to find time in her breathless schedule to share her expertise with us today. And it is with really great pleasure that I ask you now to welcome her as she presents The Stuff of Life, Animal Remains. Kate.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steve. Well, I have really been having a lot of fun with stuff this year. I hope that a lot of you recognize that the Wolf Humanities Center here at Penn is sponsoring a whole year of stuff-related stuff. I'm actually looking forward to, there's going to be a talk at the end of March on space junk as a topic. I'm really looking forward to that talk, and I've watched one of the videos that was associated with one of the talks from a psychologist from Boston who came to talk about hoarders. And some of her comments about why people love things, why people can't stop collecting stuff, what happens when people don't have enough room to put stuff, struck kind of home, and strikes kind of home to a lot of people at this museum. So I will just going to tell you that one of the things in this kind of the current wave of deaccessioning and decluttering your life, the question always is, does it give you joy? And the answer is yes. All of this gives, everything I'm going to show you tonight, broken, chewed on by animals, burned up, stepped on, all of it gives me joy. I am an easy person to enlighten perhaps, but I pride myself on being able to bring new meaning and understanding to quite disparate and quite destroyed looking stuff, and I hope that I will be able to put that across to you as well. But of course, there's very little of that kind of material on display at the Penn Museum and its exhibits. It's more of the kind of thing that you might see if you came for Archaeology Day in the fall, and I hope everyone will and have a chance to come back to the laboratories in the Center for the Analysis of Archaeological Materials, where we've got little stuff, big stuff, wrecked stuff, whole stuff. We have stuff that glitters like gold because it is made out of gold. So there is a realm of looking at things and understanding things that we pride ourselves in the archaeological sciences. And I'm going to connect some of that with things that you are more familiar with as museum visitors, as museum supporters, and maybe even people who have been involved in archaeological excavations or visits to archaeological sites yourself. So I hope that some of you recognize this image, which I've kind of nipped pretty much at random, from an exhibit that we had as a temporary loan about 4 years ago from the Lod Mosaic discovered in a classical site in Israel. And here is another piece of it. These are really wonderful, vivid depictions of fish. If you look closely, it's actually pretty clear that this, even though it represents a diversity of fish, represents a diversity of fish that appear to have been purchased at a fish market. These are kind of flat, dead-looking fish, not the way that you would experience fish if you were in the water or even if you're in a boat. But the appeal of animals is absolutely unresistible for us as museum visitors, at least for me as a museum visitors. And when you start seeing the number of animal images, animal statuettes, references, visual references to the animal world around us, you will also become alive to its many layered meanings, spiritual meanings, ritual meanings, real ecological and food type meanings. All of these things are wrapped together in a series of life experiences that we share with the world around us. And when we care for that world, we are caring for ourselves. So when we look at some of the themes that we see in the Lod Mosaic, which is thought to have been a courtyard in a nobleman's kind of villa or palace, a huge area where people would have come from several different directions, we see that this is kind of on one level, almost hokey depiction of what people thought elephants and giraffes, rhinos looked like. There's a lion at the top. There are many references to the exotic, to trade in places that people had only heard about. People are putting on the show by adding animal images totally unrelated to their actual lives around them. And when we see this kind of reference to the power, to the exoticness, to the interest and liveliness of real animal behavior, we know that we're looking at something that would have been eye-catching and important to the people who spent big bucks on putting this together. But when you look at the Penn Museum, you see that we do this all the time ourselves. We have studied the building with animal images, both from prehistory. We don't often see this. It took me a moment to remember that all of the gables on the far end of the building have lions on them. And there are both lions and fish in the mosaic friezes underneath the front wing. We have real animals. What is it? Like, what's archaeology about having a koi pond? It's just that we love the brilliance, the liveliness, the reference to the life of the villa. And then this, which was when I was a little girl, this lion fountain out by the main gate gushed water into a basin. I found that incredibly thrilling. It was one of my favorite parts in the 1960s of coming to the Penn Museum, was like dabbling my hands in the water. I'm trying to kind of get this going as one of the many building transformation projects. I've been told to forget it, but I'll just put that out there for you. This is by no means a chance a depiction of a lion on the front of the building in terms of its imperial and spiritual powers. And then, of course, we just, about a week and a half ago, we had a bunch more lions prancing and drumming and firecrackers in the courtyards for the dragon dancers that come for the Lunar New Year festivals that we have every year. So if we've put all this trouble and money and design into animals, it's just another kind of showing the hand for how important these human-animal relationships are. I will just say that apart from these more art historical, elegant manifestations, I get all kinds of animal remains that pop up around the building. I have material that has been left by hawks around the edge of the building. I have found skeletons in odd corners of the building that relate to pest management issues. And enigmatically, my boss, Marie-Claude Boileau, found a duck skull on top of a cabinet in one of the lower hallways. It's like, we can't interpret all of this, but it's like, it's life. It's life. It comes to us. So when I was a little girl, I noticed that when Julian Siggers came and gave the first talk for this series, he talked about his favorite thing. When I was a little girl, these lions were my favorite artifacts in the museum. I didn't have very sophisticated tastes. I love the cloisonné, and they're just beautiful pieces. They're not as old as some of the other material in the rotunda. I hope you all recognize that there are as a pair of male and females guarding the entry of Upper Egypt. And the female, the mom, as I put it, she's got her left paw out, and her little cub is going, rah, 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 kind of nibbling at her fingers, and she's kind of going, oh, you. To me, this is a very lively, lovely, nurturing little picture. Reminds me of some of my better days when my children were very young, kind of a kind of a thing. But these lions are serious. They have a very long history of being associated with imperial divine power. And in fact, our Asian curator, Adam Smith, has traced back some of the uses of lion iconography in East Asia to the famous lions and lion sculptures of Central Asia. So we have a sense that there is a long tradition of knowledge about animals and knowledge about how animals and power go together that are manifest when we see something like this. So there've got to be the two most famous images that we're working with in the museum right now as kind of icons of our collections. And again, I hope that you guys are all familiar with these because they are very special and very important. The one on the left is one of the two funerary panels from 6th century China. This is a very beautiful funerary structure that had many, 6 panels of horses, of which we have 2. And it's a very tender moment when the emperor is reaching up and his horse has taken an arrow for him. And he's pulling the arrow out of the horse and trying to make sure that the animal is going to be okay. Of course, his feet have fallen off. That's the 1,200 years that have passed since then. But This is a vivid and realistic and almost deceptively simple look in this plain stone. Contrast this with another very, very famous piece, the Ram in the Thicket from Ur, and you can walk down the street and this image is up on banners attracting people to the Penn Museum because we've got the place where a golden goat with a lapis lazuli and shell back is leaping up to nibble at the gold leaves and flowers of the sort of a tree of life emblem. So this is pretty flashy, and it has been well worth the amount of time that the conservators have spent restoring it to its most accurate shape and position to give us a sense for how people would have responded to it, how people would have recognized its very clear, natural aspects at the same time that the precious materials that it have made out of it made it an appropriate object to receive royal offerings. Probably the top is a place where you would have put a little special offering for the noble people whose lives were being commemorated in these kinds of places. Again, this is not the kind of thing that I do, but I want to connect a little bit with my own career because I'm not the kind of person who they just bring out the gold objects for. I want to tell you about the day when I decided I wanted to be a zooarchaeologist and study animal remains for the rest of my life. I was in the basement of the Oriental Institute, and I was taking tea with this gentleman, Robert Braidwood, who was famous even then for having studied some of the earliest agricultural villages in the Middle East at the site of Jarmo in Iraq. And just to kind of show off, he was pulling out trays of little clay figurines, and this didn't scan very well, but these little guys are about that big. And he and my undergraduate advisor were picking them up and looking at them. And he picked up the one that's marked 7 here, and he said, look, this little figurine, it's just a little quadruped. We couldn't really tell what it was, but its tail was raised in a little curl over its back. And Braidwood said, yeah, when Charlie Reed saw that, he said, I know we are going to find domesticated dogs because only a domesticated dog's tail curls over its back. And I was just captivated. I said, oh, I want to do that too. I want to work on animal domestication. I want to find early stuff. I want to find out about how people really used animals. And I have been able to do that. So the way that we do this at Penn is in the Zooarchaeology laboratory down on the corridor on the first level, beyond the secret blue door. And this is just one aspect of the Zooarchaeology laboratory. What you're looking at are bin after bin of modern skeletons. They are the reference material for me being able to match the crushed, broken bones of ancient times with the whole animal, to be able to make that connection with the whole animal, and to be able to make those animals tell the most revealing and a continual unrolling of information about the past that we can put together with other remains. So we've got this is my most requested modern skeleton is my lion, and its skull. Just the other day, I came in. This is in the middle is the skull of a lynx, and then on the right hand is a skull of a domestic cat. So people can see the story of evolution right there. You can see the story of different kinds of animals. Another thing that I just got a bunch of gifts of a bunch of bird skeletons from the University of Michigan Museum of Zoology. And this is something, it's about this long. Everyone has taken a look at it in CAAM, the skull of a hummingbird. Just incredibly tiny. Almost the tiniest skull I have in the lab, but not quite. So we see these, it's easy to see these whole animal bones as evidence for life in the past, and I want to demonstrate just briefly the kinds of things that this relates to that you're already familiar with in terms of what materials we have that we're relating to. So we're working on, off and on, in CAAM and in the rest of the museum on this range of sites. So a lot of you remember the material that we have from Gordion in Turkey. Someone came just last week to look at our animal bone collections from Gordion and take very tiny samples of them for a specialty analysis. I've got material from a site in Turkmenistan, Anaotepe, that is in kind of semi-active research. And then my most recent and in some ways most exciting work is I'm doing at very high altitudes in Peru, and what is a site that dates to about 12,000 years ago. We've got material from about 12,000 years ago in Iran as well. Those are some interesting contrasts between the end of the ice ages in one part of the world and the end of the ice ages in another part of the world. I know a lot of you have had a chance to get the blast of the energy and enthusiasm of Dr. Meg Kassebaum with her material from Smith Creek in Mississippi. Her material can come back to us and be studied in the lab because of the fact that it comes from the United States and is free of export restrictions to Pennsylvania. Then we have material from a couple of different sites for the deep and complicated past of Philadelphia. That in the 1980s, there was a series of kind of unlayering of the city's infrastructure as they took out the Reading terminal, put in the new 11th Street SEPTA station. The Penn Museum and some of its collaborators did a lot of archaeology in that region, and we have some very interesting material from a pit behind a Chinese restaurant. So there's a lot, there's fascination there, I've got to tell you. And then in active collaboration today, this is material from Fishtown, and in the laboratory we're collaborating with a series of local archaeology teams that are making I-95 do what we hope I-95 will do, at the same time that it's consistent with cultural heritage protections for both the historic cultural heritage of Philadelphia, and below that level you can see we're right against the Delaware River there, the prehistoric cultures of Philadelphia, which are tucked underneath. So I want to make clear that especially if you were here for Brian Daniels' talk on cultural heritage protections a couple of weeks ago, that we're not massively accumulating material here at Penn. Material from some of these sites, for example, from the site of Cuncaicha, all of that material stays in Peru except for very small amounts that I secure individual permits for individual pieces of bone to bring back. And likewise, the material from Gordion in the 1960s through 80s did come back to the United States, but all of that material is secure in Turkish hands that has been excavated since that time. And Smith Creek and the other local sites, as I said, that material is here to be studied. Probably the Smith Creek material will go back to Mississippi in the end. So when we make claims for really being able to wring interesting information about this, we're making a claim that's important enough to carefully collect the material, and then to save it and take good care of it here in the museum when we bring it back. So I'm just going to demonstrate, not for a ritual, in a ritual or no sacrifices, no offerings here. The daily bread and butter of what we do in the laboratory is taking a pile or a tray of bone like this and very quickly sorting it out into the animal types that it represents. And that's actually the least challenging and the quickest part of the job. You just have to memorize the shape of every single bone of every single animal that lives in the area where you are, and then be able to visualize what it would look like if it was broken into as few as 2 or as many as like 17 pieces. And then everything falls into place. So that's the easy part. That's totally the easy part. And so you just dump the stuff out, quickly sort of, and then the fun begins. So you start individually considering these individual pieces and start letting those pieces tell you about the variation of that animal's individual life, how it lasted or almost did not last in an archaeological site, and then to start being able to see the environment around it. So for example, in this batch of stuff, which is from Turkmenistan, one of the things that you can see is the edge of that tooth has a little wad of dental calculus with a distinctively fibrous look. Those are plant remains embedded into calculus deposits. This is because animals in the prehistoric past never brushed their teeth. And Chantal White, who's sitting in the back, and I have been working off and on trying to develop ways that we can make vivid the lives of these prehistoric animals by pulling off those deposits, crushing them up, and seeing what the animals ate. In addition, I get a lot of information off the life history of the animal, how old it was, how well it was taken care of, whether it was likely to have been brought to moist pasture or to be offered water. These are things that are very contingent on where the material comes from. And then there's the kind of the stuff that you might have seen me show in the lab if you've ever come back on a Come to the Lab day, the kinds of things that are very evocative of the individual act of turning this animal into meat with knives of cut marks in very characteristic places in the elbow. And then over here, it doesn't show in this picture as well as it did under the microscope, but those are the marks that after that bone was cut, after the bone was stripped of meat, then a little rodent came and gnawed on it for a little while. So it kind of gives you an idea of what this context of abandonment looked like. So because we don't bring much stuff back, but we make these big claims for how much we can tell when we look at these bones, we end up saving a bunch, and this is actually a pretty big burden on the areas with regions with very rich archaeology. So when I spent most of my time in Peru last summer, it was actually in this bedroom working through bone that I wanted to know a lot about, but would never have a chance to come back to the United States. So it started out like this. They brought me these 2 big boxes and said, we'll bring out more as you need it. And a couple of weeks later, I could barely get into bed at night because I was so set on trying to open another box, dump it out, sort it, record it, so that I could start understanding the prehistoric lives that were embedded in it. When we ask people to save this for us, when we ask people to build storage warehouses for us, when we ask people to pay attention to these remains for their own cultural heritage, this is a tall order. We really have to live up to the claims that we make, and we have to be collegial. We have to work with our local hosts in a place like Peru to train those students, to start working on their ability to do this similar kind of work themselves. And it's an order which we need the resources of North America in order to continue that ability to collaborate on every level. So the more high-end stuff that I'm doing in Peru right now involves the work of a woman I'm working with at a graduate student at Michigan State University. And we are trying to make these remains from Peru ever more valuable in terms of understanding those animal, people, plant relationships. So this is a skull of a vicuña. I'm sure you could have told that without my being here. And it has very long, continuously growing incisor teeth on the bottom. And it was easy for us to figure out, well, it wasn't easy, it took months to figure out that what we were looking at was an individual set of daily lines representing the environmental history of the animal along a developmental pathway that we're starting to establish with some certainty. So what this young woman with the red jacket on is doing is using a laser ablation technique to peel off individual daily lines of growth along this tooth and to subject those to oxygen isotope estimates of the air and water temperature in this region. We hope by this means to get the life history of that animal with respect to temperature and with seasonality, and possibly, if we get really good at this, to be able to start to crack the issues of the relationship of climate change to habitation in this place, so that we need not only animals and samples from this animals. Take a good look at this animal because it is going to take on a different role in March when we go back and take it from its corral. And then we need constant environmental monitoring so that at the same time that we are working with the living animals, we're taking water samples as well. Animal tissues are a wonderful archive of the experience of the animal that is hard enough and durable enough so that we can go back 10,000 years and really check it out. So I want to contrast that kind of more high-tech, very careful record-keeping, intensive scientific analysis with kind of a fun project that represents the kinds of work that I often do in the classroom and with visitors to the museum in helping them get to the edge of something really exciting but not really taking them all the way there. So I had a donation from the Department of Anthropology of materials that were uncovered in a storage area at the time we were renovating materials, classrooms upstairs. And when I say it was a donation, I meant that the department secretary was a former student of mine, came in and she said, could you take this? And I said, well, sure, let me take a look. And of course, it was easy to identify because there was a piece of paper in the box that said, mammoth bones. I said, Ariel, I think these are mammoth bones. It made me look like totally on top of it because actually mammoths weren't one of those animals that were on my list of the ones that I know every shape of every bone. They're new to me, and so I was learning quickly as I tried to look both expert and creative. So one of the things that I figured out with the help of the conservative an intern in the conservation department who lovingly pieced together fragments of teeth that looked like someone had given you a box of chocolate-covered graham crackers, but they had sat on it before they gave it to you. It was a real mess. And she put all these layers together with very special conservation adhesive and little strips of tissue paper, and it looked like kind of overkill, except that she was able to discern, which I had not been able to discern because it was just sitting there in fragments, that there were two teeth of two different animals. And this big bone, which is a busted off piece of the shoulder blade, can't be from those animals. These two bones, this is a finger bone and a bone of the wrist, they have to be from different animals because they're different ages. So right there, that's like 4, maybe 5 different mammoths to fit in the same box. That's even better than like one mammoth. You get 5 mammoths. So I became intensely curious. If I had all this stuff, where was it from? Why was it in this closet? How had it come to the museum? And where might it be from? Because we haven't done a lot of research on material of this age and material in this period in the museum. And I thought, gosh, with my knowledge of the museum, I really ought to be able to figure this out. So, of course, I turned the piece of paper over, another really top move, and came to a fascinating detail. Gateway to the world, Port Richmond, Philadelphia, Reading Railway System, Monday, March 2nd. What year? Well, I was a history major in college until I found anthropology, so I know how to use a perpetual calendar. There were only 6 days of March 2 between when mammoths were first discovered by the University of Pennsylvania crews and when the Reading Railroad went out of business. And it has to have been either in May 1938, 44, 49, 55, or 60. And it's like, oh. But this emboldened me to think more about the different ways that people brought stuff back to the museum, the different categories of whether or not something was in good context where we could really put it to a fine spot and really tell a story about it, versus the kind of curio aspects of this. And there were 2 people who I thought likely could have been the person who would have brought that material back to the museum and then lost track of it. One was Lauren Isley, and the other was John Kotter. Now, John Kotter was my suite mate when I first came to the museum in 1996. He was a great, great pal. And I knew him at that time as a historic archaeologist. But early on in his career, when he was still moving back and forth between his home in Nebraska and his college career here in the East, he had been one of the archaeologists at one of the earliest sites where human remains and extinct animals had been found together in North America. So it's like, likewise, Lauren Isley came from the Western Plains, had lived in and dug in, collected materials from a lot of areas where mammoths have been found, and he had a personal collection of kind of oddball specimens, some of which is still upstairs in the so-called Lauren Isley room, and some of which is in a box in the library in his archival collections. So I wasn't really sure how I could resolve this, given the fact that neither person said I left the shoulder blade of a mammoth in my desk, coming right back. But I was kind of intrigued with the idea that it could have been John Kotter, because that would have made it more important. This would have been really, really cool to have an animal bone remain that came with our very important collection of stone tools from this very early site called Blackwater Draw, the Clovis site in New Mexico. And I thought, wouldn't that be cool? We've got the stone tools. If I could say, this is the bone from that site where we first found stone tools next to extinct animals, that would be cool. That would be that would really make it worth hanging on to this material. It would be worth doing something spectacular with. And in fact, I knew that a lot of the material of the bone end from the Blackwater Draw site had been studied by people at the Academy of Science. And I talked to the archivist of the Kotter collection on this. He lives out in the western part of the state, and he said, I think it's all at the Academy. And so I went back to Kotter's drawings of what these assemblages looked like just when they were lifting off these 10, 12,000-year-old sediments. There's a big shoulder blade there. This is a shoulder blade turned upside down. And then there was a littler shoulder blade from a young animal. I thought, oh my God, what if that's it? I was so sure it was it. And so, of course, it's time for a field trip. So our CAAM's instructional support assistant, Steph Groover, helped me pack up the mammoth bones. We got on the 42 bus. We sauntered over to the Academy. We had an appointment, of course. And Ted Dashler, who's their big vertebrate paleontologist, and Ned Gilmore, who's my buddy, who's the curator of vertebrates there, got out the material that they had from the Clovis site. They weren't missing a shoulder blade. And in fact, the difference between the condition of the material that we have here at the museum and the condition from the material from the famous archaeological site was so different that it was kind of like I guess not. And it turned out we had a different species of mammoth. That we had a species of mammoth, not the Columbian mammoth of the southern plains, but more a mammoth that would have lived in the northern tundra. And then all of a sudden it hit me. I didn't even know if this was North American, because it was just mammoth. It could have been from Europe. So Steph and I kind of slunk home. We didn't have that same feeling of excitement on the way home. Ted Dashler, he said, you don't know where this is from. I don't know where this is from. If this were at my museum, I would just let people handle it and have the excitement of something extinct. And I said, okay, that's it. I'm going to take it home, and we're just going to have the excitement of having something extinct in the lab. And so I've got a book that tells me how to identify and describe this material, and I had a little bit of fun a couple of weeks ago when I took our incredibly powerful and fun-to-use digital microscope and took some pictures at high magnification of the chewing surfaces of these teeth, trying to see if I could start to see the wear that this animal's left by chewing his last little late Ice Age meal. The big tooth didn't really give me anything. It's not as well preserved as I would hope, and there has been some remineralization. This more wrecked up tooth does have an intact chewing surface on it. I took some pictures. I'm kind of excited. I might re-clean it and see if I can get a little closer to that original surface. We have tools for kind of describing stuff that are really spectacular in CAAM, and I've had a chance to look at things and visually image them in a way that very few other archaeological remains have had that recording done. And so I'm always trying to kind of push it as a way of communicating and being able to show people everywhere what I might be able to intrigue them with. And I couldn't help flattering myself a little bit when I remembered the story of this Mastodon tooth, which I don't know whether you guys recognize this of all the mastodon teeth you might have run across in Philadelphia. But this was found in the back dirt of Benjamin Franklin's house down in Franklin Square. And archival work there has associated with this with a mammoth, mastodon tooth, I should say, from Big Bone Lick in Kentucky that Thomas Jefferson ordered, and then he gave it to Ben Franklin as a present. So they could talk about kind of the glory of the big mammals in the exotic part of the United States that they hadn't had a chance to visit yet. So this is a cool piece just because it's a mastodon in this case, and it's a cool piece because of its association with the person who turned it into something else, who'd made the context of leaving Kentucky and coming to Philadelphia part of Philadelphia's story. Part of Philadelphia's story as a place where people have always thought in creative and kind of unbrindled curiosity ways where people have tried to think in long time depth, place where people kind of manage to see the world in a bigger way. And in fact, the Penn Museum represents that same part of that tradition, that we're saving stuff, we've brought stuff from far away as a group. Museum visitors and museum specialists who work here every day share that kind of unabashed curiosity about the world and use the things that we have here, whether or not they're on display, to really keep telling each other stories about what's important. I have spent a little bit more time just kind of thinking through other ways to think about animals because I have been very cognizant of the fact that I am a girl of the Delaware Valley. I have only hunted a few times, and I don't understand all of the meanings and understandings of nature that being from another cultural, spiritual, technological tradition might come from. And I've been finding myself wandering again and again over to this display in Native American Voices off to the left as you go in, which is a ledger book, a kind of a sketchbook of a guy named Carl Matches, whose original Cheyenne name was Chis Ise, who, when he was imprisoned in Florida, got his hands on an account book and started drawing pictures of the life that he remembered. And his pictures of animals tell such incredibly poignant and detailed and kind of a determination not to forget that life, which he, if you can imagine living in San Augustine, Florida, instead of living on the high plains. Big difference. So here's what some of those pictures look like. And he's labeled them with pencil and colored them in with colored pencil and a little bit of watercolor. So on the trail, and he's got a horse, the tail is tied up because they're on their way to war. The dog, you can see this is a female, she's got pups. This little swish, swish, swish is the dog barking. And then the horse is kind of going, you can see it being shown that way. And then a very careful depiction of the trade cloth and kind of fancy stuff that a horse person would have been very interested in. And then you see these little sea marks along the bottom. Those are the footprints, the hoofs of the animals that have gone back and forth along this trail. We're seeing that many people have gone there before. Here's riding through a prairie dog town. So it helped me understand that these were prairie dogs. They kind of, no one has looked at one up close, but here are the little black tails, little round ears, and the depiction of the kind of the treeless landscape of the open plains with the snake and the owls, the burrowing owls, kind of keeping those prairie dogs in check, and then the Indians coming through on the horses kind of taking pot shots at the prairie dogs as they come along. I found this to be kind of a playful look, and yet I understand that these were images that were committed to paper under a situation of imprisonment. And so there are many layers of disappointment, memory, longing involved in trying to recall a playful moment like that. Even more serious are the animal images that I think probably a lot of you came by when you came into the building this evening, when you came past one of our 2 John Wanamaker totem poles. These materials have had I don't know whether we had a party, but they've been in the museum almost 120 years now. They are really an important part of our story, as well as the part of the Haida people who we're in constant contact with, who still very much are involved in the understanding of the family relationships as well as the natural relationships of the people to the bears, and there's a hawk, and there's a beaver in this one pole on the right. So we had a visit just a couple years ago from a Haida artist named Robert Davidson, and we bought a piece of his where he shows us, this is a button blanket with another very characteristically stylized view of an animal in the midst of transforming. If you take a look, there's a lot of transformation tales in these family totem crests. He's made totem poles of his own, and he came and was able to think through the experiences of people that he had never seen embodied in the same way because of how well preserved our material was, since it's been inside instead of out in the woods for the past 100 years. So there were things that he was recovering of his own tradition by coming here. He's also gifting us with his understanding and his very generous offering of access to some of the visions that he shares with us in his knowledge of this material. The very last thing that I've returned to again and again is the Shotridge models, one of which is right in front of the business office and one of which is crammed under the stairs right now. Again, this is the kind of thing that I have loved since I was a little girl. I've always loved little tiny models. But when I think about one of our first curators of the North American collection, Louis Shotridge, himself a native member of this village, making this from craft materials that were available here in the museum, gifting us again with each one of these little miniature works of art, almost every single one of them representing an animal image, either an animal image of an ancestor of his, a great source of power, this killer whale boat, these totem crests. There's another little individual crest on the top of this very tall pole. And then if you look closely, you start to see the living, breathing use and experience of the environment. There is a deer being butchered over here on the beach, and hide and little tiny miniature slabs of meat are being hung up on the drying rack. So when we look at the care that is being taken in the relationship between humans and animals, we're looking at the care that we are offering each other. We're looking at a care that we're offering in the plants, the animals, the trees, the water. This is, for me, a compelling lesson to the material, the reason that I'm so intent upon sharing it with you and sharing it with my students and sharing it with the visitors to the museum who might only be in passing kind of connect, that this is a really important lesson for our times, as well as an important lesson for the importance of the times in the past that are represented by our collections. And I am so looking forward to inviting all of you down to our laboratories as in one of our open houses, so you can pick up the mammoth and see for yourself. So thanks very much. So I'm ready to answer questions if anyone has a question. Tina's got the mic.
Thanks. That was great, Kate. Thank you. Have you ever had a set of bones that just totally flummoxed you, where you didn't know what something was, or do you have such a background now in all these kinds of animal bones that you can pretty quickly tell what something is?
You may notice that I showed you mostly mammal bones today. I'm much, much weaker when it comes to birds and fish. There are people who only do those things, and they understand that diversity in much greater detail. So the more you stay in an inland area, the more you can get away with only knowing one group. But I don't have to know all this myself, and I don't even have to have all those collections because I work in collaboration with the collections at the Academy of Natural Sciences. Those people are always they don't get too much truck of people who want to look at the skeletons of other animals, and they're always happy to have me come down there. And we collaborate with scans, we collaborate with photographs all the time. And when I have a student who goes away, they'll show me something, they'll send me a picture, and I'll get the email, and I'll go, ugh. And then I'll email them and say, flip it over, take another picture. I need to see the other side. And sometimes that's all it takes. I know where I am. I can always say something.
What's your favorite animal? Do you have a favorite animal?
Oh,
Living or alive?
it would be the vicuña, the little wild ancestor of the alpaca that I've been working on so long. They're not nice animals, but they're incredibly cute, and they have a long record with humans that I've really enjoyed being able to trace. No, okay. Oh, but there's one.
Did those people in Peru have domesticated cats and dogs as well?
Well, they had the domesticated dog. We know the history of the dog in South America pretty well. There are no domestic cats in the New World until the Spanish brought them, though they made a lot of use of cats and cat parts. They clearly knew about cats and had strong thoughts about cats, I would say, but no domesticated cats, though those are important things.
Was there one?
There was another question, yeah.
I see you're interested in small copies of mammals. When did you begin to get interested in the small ones? Because I was just recently in Peru, and they have the museums there have a lot of those small copies.
Well, there's a fascinating sense of involvement that you get by having something miniature. The small items that we see in the archaeological record are really up for grabs in terms of interpretation. You know, are we looking at a child's toy? Are we looking at a private votive object? Are we looking at a piece of magic? All of those could potentially be an issue. We do see items of miniature scenes or miniature little images, and we shouldn't belittle them because they represent extraordinary artistry and care. And so that's an important message as well about how and why something was important in the past.
When did you get interested?
My whole life. I was the kind of girl who made tiny little books with real writing like that.
We hear a lot about ancient DNA, and particularly in tracing human evolution. Is this something that is done in any of your bones?
Indeed so. A lot of the story that I told back in the 1980s about how the alpaca was domesticated from the vicuña was not well accepted, I would have to admit, until another crew started taking the DNA and being able to show that connection. Right now, and this may seem like it's another aspect of miniaturization, but I'm involved in a project on the history of the guinea pig, looking at ancient DNA, because of course the guinea pig was domesticated in Peru and Ecuador as well. It ended up in the Caribbean, and then it was taken to Europe. And so all of us who had guinea pig remains in our assemblages were asked to sacrifice little pieces. And then they were analyzed in an ancient DNA lab in New Zealand, and we have a paper in press in the Papers of the Royal Society right now. But that is just, it tells you exactly why we should be saving stuff. It shows you why we have to have a commitment to hanging on to these. Like, people walk in and they say, Kate, you have 1 million bones, and that's like actually kind of a round estimate. Like, why do you need so much? You have already studied them. You know, can't we like move them else? You know, what more is there? It's like, I can't tell you what more there'd be. I've done all this isotopic work. I've started to do this DNA work, and then someone will write and say, I have a new idea, and you've got the samples because you were so careful for the last 50 years to keep track of this material. You've got the sample I need to tell a new story. And that's very exciting, and kind of gives us museum specialists kind of like a feeling like, you know, once again, we've won.
Before going to Peru, did you do any special preparation to get prepared for the high altitudes?
I didn't have any idea what it would be like. This was before Title IX, so I had grown up to be just a total couch potato. And I had other concerns. I thought, gosh, I started working in South America quite quickly after my earlier career working in North America. I thought, I need to learn Spanish. I need to learn the geography of Peru. I need to learn every one of the bones of the animals and what they look like when they're crushed. And I wonder how I'll do it at high altitude. I was brought up in Delaware, you know, easily 20 feet above sea level on a really good day. And as it happens, I'm really good at that. But I realized that I should have maybe even have been more careful, and I need to be careful with my students. The site where I'm working now is actually pretty high. It's about 15,000 feet. And we don't just go. We take a very careful 3-day gradual ascent, and we don't stay up overnight until we know that everyone's okay. But like nothing in archaeology is worth disability or serious illness. But these are the thing that you raise as an issue is, how did the ancient people do it? What does it mean when we have early occupation at such a high altitude, about how they might have been adapted to it physically, how they might have adapted to it culturally, you know, little woolly vicuña socks, little woolly vicuña robe, that would be good, but in the end it all comes down to oxygen. So these are critical points which we're working on from a number of different perspectives, and my job as the person working on the animals is to say, don't worry that there are no plants up here. There are enough animals to eat so that people could have sustained life at this altitude under certain circumstances. And then the physical anthropologists working on the bioarchaeological remains are looking at how big these guys' chests were, taking DNA to see if they actually carried some of the specific genes which are associated with high altitude resistance. How early can we find that in the archaeological record? These are really cool issues to be able to compare with quite far-flung regions like, for example, the Himalayas, where the ancient people did it in a totally different way with different biology, different technology, and at a different time period.
When do you think the people reached Peru? And did they come over the land bridge? Is that the basic thought?
Yeah, they did. I personally, because I'm working on the large animals, I have been interested in the way that people learning about the animals in northern North America would have helped them learn about the animals of the plains, which would have helped them learn about the animals in Mexico, which would have helped them just kind of hold their breaths and then run till they got to Colombia. And then following the relatively high plateaus, but ones that would have looked a lot like the plains, being able to use those same hunting skills, that same ability to understand animal behavior, that same ability to know what a good hunting tool is for an animal of a certain size, possibly even a sense of some kind of ritual or religious relationship with those animals. Why, if you didn't have that, would you be painting, red ochre pictures of the animals that you're hunting on the walls of your cave, the way they did at Kunkaicha? I personally am leaning towards this as being the central original adaptation. And we are working with archaeologists now who are trying to see what the evidence is for did people go down to the coast and fish or gather plant materials in those lower valleys at the same time. It's a very hot issue. I'm just for kind of the purposes of making the most of what I'm doing. I'm open to many hypotheses, but the one that I'm collecting information where I get more signals is for it being along the high spine of the Andes. But it's easy for me to say. There are other people, even Peruvians, who really suffer up there, and they figure no one could ever live. And it's like the archaeology says that people could live. Excellent, excellent questions. Thank you.